Welcome to this channel where history gets rearranged into plain English. Now, to our real topic, we go right into some of the greatest and most iconic women in history. Queen Victoria. A lonely childhood at Kensington Palace and a giant task to rule upon the biggest empire the world had ever seen will mark her journey of love, loss, strength, and legacy. This video, no doubt, will offer a very easy-to-follow story narration with some insight useful to the English learners or perhaps just the lovers of history. So go get a nice cup of tea and let's view the Victorian era through the eyes of the Queen, who epitomized it. At the turn of the 19th century, Britain was waiting for its own change. The Industrial Revolution was in full flow. Napoleonic Wars had changed the face of Europe, and a generation of new royals was coming in. Into this world of change was born a baby girl on the 24th of May, 1819, in Kensington Palace, London. What few could have foreseen at the time was that Alexandrina Victoria was to become one of the most iconic monarchs in history, the Queen Victoria that was the emblem of a century. Victoria's path to the throne, however, was far from direct. By rather complicated family politics and arrangements, she was the daughter of Prince Edward, Duke of Kent and Strathearn, the fourth son of King George III, and Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, a German princess. Victoria was born fifth in line to the throne. The odds of ever wearing the crown seemed remote. But destiny would play a grand hand. The three eldest sons of George III neither produced a legitimate heir. Her father, Prince Edward, died when she was a baby of 8 months, and in the following 10 years, her uncles, the Dukes of York and Clarence, were either childless or lost their children at an early age. It was out of all keeping that the crown was drifting toward the little, mouthless girl quietly living in Kensington Palace. By about the time of her 11th birthday, it was becoming increasingly evident that the young Victoria was to be the future of the British monarchy. Victoria's early years were dominated by a very controlling and protective system hammered out of her mother and her advisor, Sir John Conroy. A very strict one, later called the Kensington system, from being isolating and regimented. She was not allowed to play with children of her age. Every minute was filled. Lessons in languages and geography, practicing the piano, and religion. She was never alone. Not even her meals or playtime were without supervision. The object of her mother and Conroy in this system was to keep control over Victoria and keep her dependent. They wished that, upon Victoria's accession, such power and influence would be bestowed by her upon Conroy. Though their whole scheme was destined to backfire by instilling in Victoria an indomitable will to be independent. With an intensity of hatred, she described him as a demon incarnate. Victoria's mind flourished and expanded despite all the restrictions. As a child, she was intelligent, curious, and strong-willed. She liked drawing, history, and storytelling. Her instruction was to be a moral one of duty and monarchy, the very things that were to prepare her for a future that, against every odds, was being pulled toward her with each passing day. Since Victoria was a little girl, she had meticulously maintained a journal. In the entire life period, she kept it. The diaries give extremely vivid descriptions of her feelings, fears, and emerging identity. From a very early age, she was clear, very decisive, and very much aware of her existence within the great sweep of history. She loved her dog Dash, who proved to be a continual comfort during the long, lonely hours at Kensington. Victoria's relationship with her half-sister Feodora was one delight in her life, and as Feodora married and returned to Germany, the young queen's loneliness set in. George IV died in 1830. His successor, William IV, did not have surviving legitimate issues. Now everybody knew that the young princess was heir presumptive. Breathless anticipation awaited her coming of age at 18. On the early morning of June 20th, 1837, at 6 o'clock, the Lord Chamberlain and Archbishop of Canterbury woke from her sleep the newly 18-year-old Victoria. King William IV was no more, and Victoria was now Queen of the United Kingdom. She wrote in her diary, "At 6 a.m., Mamma woke me up, telling me that the Archbishop of Canterbury and Lord Conyngham were there to see me. I got out of bed in my dressing gown and proceeded to the sitting room to receive them alone. Lord Conyngham then apprised me that my dear uncle, the king, was no more, having expired at 2 minutes past 12 this morning. Hence, I am the queen." That was that. The girl who had been under tight surveillance suddenly became the supreme ruler of the British Empire. Despite being so young and untrained, she took her new responsibilities seriously and with confidence. One of the very first things she resolved to do was get away from Conroy and out of Kensington Palace. She took residence in Buckingham Palace, a royal dwelling never before used as an operative home. The accession of Victoria was greeted with public approval. She was a clean slate, a new era, after the scandals and debaucheries of her uncle's reigns. The people saw in her innocence, morality, and hope. Her first premier, Lord Melbourne, acted as her political guardian. At 58, he was an experienced statesman and took the young queen under his paternal care, showing her the politics and workings of government. They became very close. So close, indeed, that rumors spread of a romantic liaison, but the relationship was only platonic. Lord Melbourne showed her the ropes of court etiquette, cabinet affairs, and parliamentary matters. By his guidance, she began learning about the working of constitutional government balance between the monarchy. However, tension was ever present, and one of the very first major crises Victoria was to face was the so-called bedchamber crisis of 1839. When Melbourne resigned, the newly appointed would-be Prime Minister, Sir Robert Peel, asked Victoria to dismiss some of her ladies-in-waiting, many of whom were wives or daughters of Whigs and political opponents. Victoria refused to do so. So grave an issue was it that Peel decided against forming a government, and Melbourne came back. This episode served to highlight the constitutional dilemmas that may be posed by a monarch exercising too much personal influence. Victoria would learn the lesson of trying to do so in her own maturing. Victoria viewed her royal duties with earnestness. She sat in meetings with ministers, went through government documents, and kept up correspondence with foreign monarchs. She was determined to be a working queen, not just a figurehead. Still, the older court was rife with gossip and scheming. Her mamma was still an irritant, especially with Conroy lingering in her household. Victoria finally forced Conroy into retirement and began to run her court by her own rules. One of the great personal pleasures during these early years was her large family in Germany. Victoria shared a close relationship with her uncle, Leopold I, King of the Belgians, who acted as a trusted advisor. He began to hint at a possible marriage for her, his nephew and her cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. His first meeting with Albert was in 1836. Victoria found him handsome, but was ambivalent about the marriage. Theoretically, joining Albert started to appeal to her, especially by means of some subtle encouragement from Leopold. In the first few years of her reign, she had already begun the transformation of the monarchy in her own image. She was young, yet strong, female, yet able to command respect in a man's world. An era in which women hardly used power. Here she was, sovereign of the largest empire on earth. She mixed court rules with her own personality and gave the first sign of a woman who would mingle youthful charm with regal dignity. Her earnestness and modesty were adored by the British people. Foreign statesmen watched her rise with interest. Some doubted her capabilities, while others were awed by her strength. What awaited her was a reign of immense consequence, annihilating not just one woman, but also a nation, and not to forget, an entire era. But at that point, she was still drawing her vision, still fashioning her life, and learning what it truly meant to be a queen. Next comes the actual romantic chapter of her story, and from there, the most enduring royal association of contemporary times was established, that is, her marriage to Prince Albert. The initial years of Queen Victoria's reign were marked by gradual changes, transformations from a young and unsure monarch to a woman of conviction and power. But a major turning point was about to occur, one that would shape her private life and public reign for decades. Her marriage to Prince Albert. In October 1839, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha arrived in England on yet another visit. He was tall, handsome, and intelligent, well-versed in the sciences, languages, philosophy, and the arts. Albert and Victoria were first cousins, and their bond had been discreetly encouraged by their common uncle, King Leopold I of Belgium. During this visit, Victoria, at age 20, had become deeply impressed by Albert's gentlemanly demeanor, intellect, and sense of duty. On the 15th of October, just 5 days after his arrival, Queen Victoria offered herself in marriage to Albert. Constitutionally, she, being the monarch, was expected to be the one to propose the marriage. She wrote in her diary, "It was with some effort that I said to him, 'Would you give me the great happiness of accepting me as your wife?' Albert accepted. The engagement was received with joyful acclamation by the royal family, and on the 10th of February, 1840, the marriage between Queen Victoria and Prince Albert was solemnized in the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace. A public celebration took place in the streets of London. Victoria picked a white wedding dress, which was influentially later accepted as the standard for Western bridal attire. The marriage was far from just a royal formality. It was a close, deep, and abiding union. Though Albert was never crowned king, his official title being Prince Consort, he almost immediately proved to be one of the most important persons within Victoria's life. At first, some British politicians and courtiers resented his foreign origin and questioned his place at court. But in time, Albert's brilliance and industry silenced all criticism. Albert used to advise Victoria on state papers and help with the growing concerns of her family. He took much upon his shoulders concerning matters of education, science, charity, and public reform. He was keen on the modernization of the monarchy's public image, seeing it as a more morally upright, modest, and accessible institution to the common people. He modernized the royal household, cut off needless expenditure, and brought purpose and discipline into royal life. Nevertheless, along with being emotionally dependent on Albert, Victoria had respect for his intellect and asked for his opinion on state affairs more and more. There were occasional disagreements in their marriage. Victoria had a temper, Albert was overly serious, but their bond was utterly unbreakable. The couples had 9 children between 1840 and 1857. 1. Victoria, Princess Royal, 1840. Irandam Pulli, Albert Edward, later King Edward VII, 1841. 3. Princess Alice, 1843. Nangam Pulli, Prince Alfred, 1844. Aindu Pulli, Princess Helena, 1846. Aravathu, Princess Louise, 1848. Yedi Pulli, Prince Arthur, 1850. Ettu Pulli, Prince Leopold, 1853. 9. Princess Beatrice, 1857. Victoria endured difficult and often exhausting pregnancies. At times, she considered motherhood rather burdensome, yet she adored her children, though she could be firm and severe. Albert, on the other hand, was particularly hands-on in their formation, ensuring they received an education in a medley of languages, arts, history, and science. As the children grew up, they were married off in a very calculated manner to royal houses across Europe, hence earning Queen Victoria the sobriquet of Grandmother of Europe. Prince Albert was a man of vision, especially in matters pertaining to modern science, industry, and education. His boldest project was, without doubt, the conception, organization, and realization of the Great Exhibition of 1851 at the Crystal Palace in Hyde Park, London. The exhibition was a show of innovations from all over the world: machinery, art, and cultural objects. The exhibition received more than 6 million visitors, including Charles Darwin and Charles Dickens. It was an extreme triumph and put Britain on the map as a leader of the industrial age. Albert used the monies raised to further educational and cultural enterprises in South Kensington, which later were developed into the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Natural History Museum, and the Science Museum, lasting legacies of his deep affection for learning. Victoria was proud of this man above all others. To her, this moment was one of the most glorious of her entire reign. While Victoria and Albert's domestic life remained very happy, their reign was far from peaceful. Political agitation, social changes, and world crises confronted the throne in the 1840s and 1850s. A movement of the working class demanding political reforms was gathering strength in the 1830s and 1840s. It was Chartism. The movement sought the right of all men to vote, ballots cast in secret, and equal representation of Parliament. Though the Crown maintained its distance from the movement, Victoria and Albert felt some awareness of inequality increasing. Albert sided with improvements in the fields of public health and education, even if his own family was not openly supportive of all of Chartist's aims. The Great Famine in Ireland, 1845 to 1849 devastated the population and laid bare the inadequacies of British policy. Victoria donated personally to relief efforts and campaigned for them. Nevertheless, public opinion in Ireland remained hostile to the British Crown. This famine gave Anglo-Irish relations a bitter legacy that haunted them for decades. In Victoria's reign of 30 years, several attempts against her life occurred. From 1840 to 1850, there had been at least 8 attempts on her life by gunmen, lunatics, and extremists. She was unscathed. Each time, she could return so quickly and without fear to the public life that she had gained mass admiration. These events helped crystallize her image as a brave and resolute monarch. In Victoria's and Albert's time, the empire was rapidly extended. Albert was no warmonger, but annexation of territories in India, Africa, and the Pacific was overseen by the government. Victoria followed these developments very closely and considered the empire her pride. Victoria and Albert were also proponents of peaceful international diplomacy. Albert played a silent but very important role in stopping war between Britain and the United States during the Trent Affair of 1861, when a British ship was boarded by the U.S. Navy amid the American Civil War. His carefully worded communication helped cool down the crisis and avoided any escalation on a military level. Victoria had lived a very unstable life, caught between private wants and public duties. She longed for the little pleasures of domestic life, but had to wear the crown in times of both triumph and tragedy. Her great love for Albert sometimes made her blind to criticism. She tended to see the whole world in neat divisions. Those who supported her and Albert were in the right. Those who opposed them were wrong. Stubborn and emotional, she could sometimes be, but she grew as she got older. From Albert came the concept of constitutional monarchy, not ruling alone, but ruling wisely with help from elected officials. Together, they started to transform the British royal family from merely rulers to moral leaders, patrons of culture, and a symbol of national unity. By the close of the 1850s, the couple had reached the height of their power. Their children were growing up, public opinion was fairly strong, and the outline of a new sort of monarchy began to appear. But some cruel fate had to intervene. In early 1861, Victoria's mother, the Duchess of Kent, died. In spite of their difficult relationship, there was a grievous blow to Victoria. She leaned heavily on Albert for comfort. Albert was ill too. Years of overwork, even overexertion in grief-stricken sympathy with the Queen, had brought on various stomach ailments. Before Christmas 1861, again did his health break down. The Holy Box of History records him as dying of typhoid fever, but some modern historians contend cancer for him. On 14th December 1861, Prince Albert died at Windsor Castle, aged just 42 years. The Queen was inconsolable. "My life as a happy person has ended," she wrote. "The world is gone for me." She entered a deep and lasting period of mourning. She put on her black dress for life and retired into privacy. The death of Albert was not just the loss of a husband. It was end to her other half, her most trusted partner, and the architect of her royal vision. The December 1861 death of Prince Albert cast a deep and unyielding shadow over the life of Queen Victoria. Gone was the man she had called her angel, and perfect husband at the young age of 42. To Queen Victoria, this loss was more than personal, a bit of tearing from the very fabric of her own existence. She went into isolation, living with sorrow and symbolic mourning, into a deep state of withdrawal from being that world had admired and known as an assured and consummate actress. Nevertheless, even in the midst of her grief, majestic Victoria converted herself into a slow vessel for a symbol of British identity by steering monumental changes in empire, politics, and public life. The mourning for Albert was absolute. She wore black for the rest of her life and ordered that all photographs, images, rooms, and objects associated with him be preserved just as they were. At Windsor Castle, Osborne House, and Balmoral, the rooms were kept as shrines. His shaving brush, writing instruments, and clothing remained undisturbed. Meals were even brought to his room, as if he were still alive. Victoria's withdrawal from public appearances was aggravated by criticism. Much written that the Queen was a very inaccessible figure was created when the Queen had ceased to attend any official ceremonies. However, by royal correspondence, Victoria kept to her engagements. She signed documents, read the state papers, and entertained letters. By the late 1860s, the dissatisfaction of the public turned into vocal expression in the newspapers against the propriety of the Queen's prolonged seclusion. She justified herself in writing, "I am doing my duty, though it is a very hard and sad one." Without question, the nation expected the Queen to be seen and heard. As much as her suffering was great and dear, surely the Crown had a need of a public face. There was an uneasy conflict operating here between private loss and public duty. Victoria's extended mourning created a wane in public life, and it did grow to the boldness of the critics of the monarchy. For the first time in several centuries, people began to show a glint of interest in republicanism, the possibility that the government might do without a king. This was especially the case amongst working-class reformers and certain sectors of the press. Pamphlets were circulated questioning the cost of maintaining the royal family. Cartoons mocked the Queen's absence from ceremonial events. Calls for reform extended beyond politics. They now included the very structure of Britain's monarchy. One particularly vocal critic was Charles Bradlaugh, the radical MP and atheist who challenged on more than one occasion the relevancy of monarchy in a modern age. The Reform League, campaigning for universal male suffrage, was by that time also in favor of republicanism. Those attacks hurt Victoria deeply, but she refused to be rushed. Gradually, and after careful calculation, she started to emerge from her seclusion back into public life. During her years of mourning, Queen Victoria found enough comfort in the Scottish Highlands at Balmoral Castle, an estate that she and Albert loved dearly. The harsh landscape, the isolation, and an uncomplicated country way of life did much to soothe her. It was at Balmoral that she became close to one of the most controversial figures in her life. John Brown, a Scottish gillie and former servant of Prince Albert. Brown was as outspoken as he was loyal and treated Victoria not as a monarch, but as a grieving widow. He taught her to ride again after her long lament, walked for hours with her, and gave her companionship in a time of emotional desolation. Rumors abounded regarding the nature of that relationship. Some believed the two were lovers. Others even alleged that they had been secretly married. No evidence exists to back these claims, though the nature of their intimacy is obvious. Victoria affectionately referred to him as my dear servant and Brownie, and he referred to her as woman or woman in private. The newspaper journalists scorned their relationship, but Victoria couldn't have cared less. Brown was her salvation in those cruel years. Towards the 1870s, a fresh breeze upon the political scene resuscitated the public image of Victoria, the great orator and great 19th century charismatic prime minister of the Conservative Party. Unlike many politicians who had found Victoria cold or difficult, Disraeli flattered and charmed her with respect as a true partner in government. He called her the Fairy Queen and once said, "Everyone likes flattery, and when you come to royalty, you should lay it on with a trowel." Victoria was quite fond of him. She wrote that, "He is full of poetry, romance, chivalry, and wit." Disraeli did much to breathe new life into the British Empire's unity, with Victoria playing a key role therein. Disraeli, in 1876, conferred upon her the title Empress of India, the very title designed to forge closer ties between India and the British Crown, following the Indian Rebellion of 1857 and the dissolution of the East India Company. Victoria and her newfound title gave her a new purpose, a new identity beyond the shadow of her loss. She signed documents as Victoria R. First period, Regina et Imperatrix, Latin for Queen and Empress. Although she never visited India, she was fascinated by its people, culture, and governance. She picked up some Hindustani phrases and appointed Indian servants late in life, including the now famous Abdul Karim. The declaration of Victoria as the Empress of India signified the zenith of British imperialist ambitions, at which the Queen became its living symbol. Gladstone and Victoria hardly got along. Victoria admired Disraeli, but Gladstone's view was different. Gladstone's earnestness, studious nature, and moralistic tendencies were perhaps what Albert would have liked, but what Victoria always found boring. Victoria commented once about Gladstone, "He speaks to me as if I were in a public meeting." Gladstone's views on democracy, Irish Home Rule, and parliamentary reform contradicted Victoria's instincts. She was more for stability, empire, and monarchy as forces for unity. Nonetheless, she respected the office and tolerated him when he returned multiple times to be prime minister. The competition between Disraeli and Gladstone formed Victorian politics and also highlighted Victoria's increasing role as a constraint upon a society undergoing rapid changes. After long years of personal sorrow, and due to public skepticism, Queen Victoria was afforded a new triumphant moment. The Golden Jubilee in 1887 marked her 50th year on the throne. Therefore, the event shaped her place at the forefront of British life and sudden imperial history. The celebrations included a Thanksgiving service at Westminster Abbey, a procession through London attended by thousands, dignitaries and monarchs from across the globe, Indian princes in full regalia, colonial officials, and foreign royals all paying homage. For Victoria, it was both a personal and political event. The endurance of the Queen and the symbolic unification of a vast and diverse empire. She had exceeded the reign of any previous British monarch and had come to embody the age itself. Her journals state how deeply satisfying she found the event. No sovereign was ever more loved than I am. By the 1880s, she slowly transitioned from a self-retreating widow into an almost mythical figure, the grandmother of Europe, mother to a dynasty, and face of an empire. Her image was everywhere, on stamps, coins, portraits, and statues. Her very name became synonymous with a period, the Victorian age. However, while her stature grew, so did the world around her. The empire was vast, but challenges loomed. Movements for Irish Home Rule were getting stronger. The working-class masses demanded social reforms. Colonial conflicts challenged Britain for dominion in Africa and Asia. And yet, technological revolutions altered society. The railway, electric light, telephone. Victoria was aware of all this change, yet stood for continuity. In times of change, she was the anchor. Throughout her reign, Queen Victoria defeated the limitations imposed on women in her era. Ironically, she had very conservative views about women and their role in society. She was against women's suffrage and took the view that a woman's place was strictly in the home. Yet, in many ways, she was a woman of incredible power in a man's world. She presided over wars, revolutions, and reforms. She advised prime ministers, swayed public opinion, and changed the course of history. Her very existence was proof that a woman could govern with power, wisdom, and dignity. John Brown died in 1883, apparently unexpectedly, thus plunging Victoria into another dark hole. She commissioned memorial statues and portraits and published leaves from the Journal of Our Life in the Highlands. Although she never publicly acknowledged the full intensity and nature of that relationship, her grief for Brown was probably as profound as that for Albert, for now she was confronted, once again, with living without the man who had supported her through her most vulnerable years. But in her twilight years, Victoria appeared mostly shaped by sorrow and experienced strength therein. Having lost the two great men of her life, Albert and Brown, she rose on her own as a symbol of endurance. Her empire went around the world. Her family was intertwined with nearly every royal house in Europe. The people, who had once doubted her reclusion, now revered Victoria as the mother of the nation. It was not industrial progress or conquest that defined the Victorian era. It was a queen who, in grief and glory, became a symbol of continuity in change. At the end of the 1880s, Queen Victoria stood not simply as a monarch, but as a global symbol. Her reign had well surpassed 50 years, and she was, for the time, the longest reigning British monarch. With empires rising and falling, revolutions echoing through continents, and technology affecting the most mundane of day-to-day activities, Victoria became the steady heartbeat of a transitioning world. She was not just Empress of India and Queen of the United Kingdom, but rather a living link between the past and the future. A woman born at the birth of the industrial age who would witness the birth of the modern world. This last chapter covers the final 14 years of her reign and the many transformations the course of European history undertook through her descendants. 10 years after the Golden Jubilee, in 1897, the Diamond Jubilee was celebrated by Queen Victoria to mark 60 years at the helm. The occasion was without parallel in scale, pageantry, and symbolism. The British Empire had now reached its height, its domain accounting for 1/4 of Earth's surface and ruling over nearly 400 million souls. Victoria, who had once been an awkward teenager on the throne, was now the mother of an empire of unimaginable vastness. The Diamond Jubilee was celebrated with a splendid procession through the streets of London, daily parades and salutes from the entire empire, royalty and dignitaries from all corners of the globe, public festivities across Britain and the Commonwealth. Victoria, by then 78, rode through crowds in a snow-white lace cap far in the open carriage. Her health seemed failing, yet the love shown by the crowds had deeply touched her. She wrote, "It is indeed touching to see the love with which I am regarded by all classes." There could be no doubt the public emotion had capped the transformation of the grieving widow into the grandmother of Europe. Victoria had 9 children and 42 grandchildren. With the help of advantageous marriages, her family became interwoven with nearly every major royal house in Europe. These alliances were to maintain peace. However, they also would bring a large part of Europe into World War I. Her descendants include Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, her grandson by Princess Victoria, Queen Maud of Norway, Queen Sophie of Greece, Empress Alexandra Feodorovna of Russia, wife of Tsar Nicholas II, King George V of the United Kingdom, her grandson and future sovereign. Thus, due to these family ties, the royal houses of Germany, Britain, Russia, Norway, Greece, Romania, and Spain could all trace their descent from Victoria. In correspondence with her children and grandchildren, she gave advice, expressed opinions on politics, and even intervened in royal marriages. Her power had therefore extended far beyond Britain's shores. However, her closely knit family ties did not always guarantee harmony. Often, Victoria found herself in the midst of dynastic disputes, especially between her grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm II, and the rest of Europe. Though the Diamond Jubilee was a moment to celebrate, the British Empire had its problems. The late years of Victoria were the time for rising anti-colonial resistance, wars, and political challenges. A big controversy in Victoria's later years was the Second Boer War in South Africa. British forces battled the Boer republics, an independent state founded by the Dutch settlers. The war was long, brutal, and unpopular. It exposed the limitations of British military power and sparked endless discussions on the morality of imperialism. When Britain started using concentration camps, thousands of civilians were dying. Many were women and children, damaging their moral authority. Victoria supported the troops and sent personal messages of encouragement. Yet it caused her emotional distress in her final months as she felt the sheer costs of imperium. Victoria saw monumental changes in technology, society, and thought during the last couple of decades of her life. During her lifetime, she had witnessed the invention of telegraph, telephone, and electric light, the spreading of railways and automobiles, the works of Charles Darwin, Karl Marx, and Sigmund Freud, urbanization, public education, and the labor movement, initial calls for women's suffrage. Though Victoria was conservative by nature, she was the figurehead during one of the most progressive and dynamic periods in British history. She herself was opposed to women making political issues of themselves and said, "The Queen is most anxious to enlist everyone who can speak or write to join in checking this mad, wicked folly of women's rights." Despite her opposition, her reign saw the laying of a foundation from which women would eventually be able to vote, be educated, and work. Paradoxically, the story of a queen provided the starting point for the rise of women. At the dawn of the 20th century, Victoria's health began to decline. She was afflicted with rheumatism, an eye disorder, and insomnia. She could no longer climb stairs, nor was she physically able to walk very far. Yet, she bore on with stoic determination. She continued with increasingly long stays at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, her cherished retreat with Prince Albert. In her preferred surroundings, her life drifted slowly to a close. By the onset of January 1901, the Queen had taken to losing consciousness intermittently. Family members from England gathered around her, including her eldest son and the future King Edward VII, and her grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm II. On January 22, 1901, Queen Victoria died at the age of 81, after reigning for 63 years and 216 days, at the time the longest reign of any British monarch. Her last words are said to have been Bertie, the childhood name of her son Edward. Victoria's funeral was a great occasion, combining elements of her imperial status with her personal wishes. She was to be dressed in white, not black, as she herself had desired. As her coffin was lowered, placed inside was a photograph of John Brown and a lock of Prince Albert's hair. The funeral procession drew troops from all corners of the empire, India, Africa, Canada, and Australia. She was interred beside Prince Albert at Frogmore Mausoleum, Windsor. Thus came the end of the Victorian era, an era of empire, industry, moral reform, and social change. From Queen Victoria, the legacy is monumental, complicated, and deeply embroidered in British identity. First, the constitutional monarchy. Victoria helped transition Britain from a monarchy of influence into one of symbolism and stability. She had strong opinions, but respected constitutional limits. It was during her rule that the modern British monarchy was sculpted as visible, ceremonial, and above politics. Irandam the British Empire. There was this great expansion of the British Empire during her reign. She became the living emblem of the empire, being taught about in schools and erected in images in courthouses and railway stations across the continents. It also turns into the legacy of colonialism wrought with all the contradictions. 3. Cultural and moral influence. Victorian quickly came to appraise an era punctuated by prudence, decorum, industry, and family. Whether admired or mocked, the Victorian values remain entwined within historical identity. The royal family's role in public life. Victoria refashioned the royal family's position in public life. Through her periods of mourning, royal jubilees, and personal visibility, she showed that the monarchy could be engaged to touch hearts and become symbols for the people. Queen Victoria was not only a sovereign, she was an idea of continuity in an age of upheavals, a woman of extraordinary endurance, the centerpiece of a world-sprawling empire. She ruled through an age that saw more change than any that preceded it. from carriages drawn by horses to telephones, from feudal arrangements to world empires. She began as an unsure and inexperienced teenager. She ended as a revered empress, a grandmother to kings and queens, and the heartbeat of a global era. Although the world she left behind was already evolving past those Victorian ideals she had come to represent, her legacy remained ingrained in history. As Britain marched into the 20th century, Queen Victoria's reign was classed as both the last chapter of the old world and the first chapter of the new. She had become far more than a queen in her long life. Thanks for watching this wonderful journey through the life of Queen Victoria, a woman who became an era. We hope you enjoyed learning about her childhood, her love story with Prince Albert, the height of the British Empire, and her unforgettable legacy. If you felt like this video helped you, do some of that liking, subscribing, and sharing with friends who love history or are learning English. Comment down below and tell us which part of Queen Victoria's life inspired you the most.